Okay, so we're here to talk about some pretty significant findings and interlapping that with some truth-telling from our families and understanding how that also looks in practice with the carceral system that we are all caught up in. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge country, that we're standing on land that was never ceded, and we draw our strength from elders past and present and their ancestors. I also want to take the time to pay respect and acknowledge the thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of Aboriginal children and families who have been and continue to be impacted by child protection systems every day. So a bit of an overview of what to expect. We're going to go through some of the quantitative findings using population level linked data, and then we're going to be unpacking the child protection system responses through a decolonial lens and a carceral lens, and then we're going to be weaving truth-telling throughout. So just quickly, for those who haven't heard of the Bring Them Home, Keep Them Home project, it's about understanding restoration pathways and experiences of Aboriginal families and practitioners working in New South Wales. It's about understanding those experiences, the institutional barriers, understanding what restoration is happening across the state. And we've been so privileged to learn a lot about those really fantastic parts of exemplary practice, innovative and creative practice, but also challenging and pushing back against systems. What we'll be talking about specifically a lot today is the understanding the problem from the child's view, and Kathleen will talk about what that looks like, but that's all part of that, decolonial lens of moving away from system-centric views of how we look at data and how we look at experiences within the system. Just also acknowledging our amazing research team made up of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal researchers and academics and research officers. We are really privileged to have the amazing team that we have. And the research has got just under a year left, and it's funded by the Australian Research Council. So Bring Them Home, Keep Them Home is Aboriginal led and controlled. We have our amazing partner organisations that we work very closely with, ABSEC, Waminda, South Coast AMS and Illawarra Aboriginal Corporation. We've done a deep dive into the Illawarra Shoalhaven region to understand restoration and experiences in child protection. Down that way, we've held a few community forums. We've interviewed 20 Aboriginal families and a range of practitioners and stakeholders. And we've held a few parent gatherings now. Our parents, our amazing North Stars and our experts, and we love the opportunity and they love the opportunity to come back together as much as we can. And for those of you that were in the session a couple of days ago where we were so privileged to hear their voices, you really just hear the strength and how much they want their stories told. And this conference is all about truth-telling, so what better opportunity. And then many of you in this room have also been part of our practitioner forums that we've held across the state, which we are really grateful for as well. So I'll hand over to Kathleen, who will talk a bit about the population level data, and I'll be popping in and out. Can I get a roving mic for up here?
So what we're about to take a look at now is the findings from the first analysis for the project that we've done using whole of population data. And so we've called this the scale and timing of first-time child protection contacts among New South Wales Aboriginal children born from 2006 through to 2018, and we've done this work using the New South Wales Child E-Cohort project data asset that my research team has built. So we're talking about whole populations of children in a jurisdiction through that period. And of course, we are a big team of people, as BJ said, a team of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal researchers with a range of different types of expertise. So I'd just like to start by acknowledging that every number on the following slides that I'm going to show you represents children. And of course, every child has a family and community that loves them. And our goal in this research, using the population level data, is to centre the experiences of children and their families rather than the system view when we are using whole population data to inform opportunities for system redesign. So what do I mean when I talk about the system view? Well, I think you'd all be familiar with things like the AHW annual reports and the DCJ FAXIA website, where you get these 12-month snapshots. 12-month snapshots. And a 12-month snapshot looks something like 1 in 33 children receive child protection services in 12 months. Now, when we're talking about centering the view on children and families, we want to look at what we call the child's life course view. So children and families aren't particularly interested in understanding how many kids are in the system at a point in time. They're more interested about when people are hitting the system across the life course, progressing and escalating interventions through their own lives. So this is the approach we're taking, is over the time of children's lives rather than the system each year, which is a sort of statistic that's relevant for funding services in a particular year, but isn't about what's happening across the course of children's lives. So we've built this research data asset working with government data custodians to integrate data from many different sectors that work with children and families. So from the time mums are pregnant and receiving antenatal care in the healthcare system, we've got birth registrations and lots of different health data sets like hospitals, emergency, mental health data. We've recently integrated the Commonwealth data contacts like our MBS claims and our medicine dispensings, immunisations, things like this. We've got education outcomes, so every 3 years since 2009 we've collected child development data nationally. And you probably all know about the NAPLAN tests that go in through the school years. Then we've integrated child protection data, so everything from the reports into the system through to removals into out-of-home care. And child youth justice contacts as well as parent justice contacts. And we've also integrated in public housing waitlist and tenancy. Of course, there's more. There's always more data to be integrated. And we have actually worked with health to integrate in data from health services in districts, which is fragmented across 15 districts in the state. So we're always working with different services and custodians to continue to build that view of children and families' contacts and outcomes over time. So it looks like my animations are gone, which might prove interesting. But basically, this slide's trying to show you the life course view. So I actually have the system view. It's not all going to pop up in pieces like it should. But if you just look at the 2019 column, it's a snapshot through all the children's ages. So all kids who, let's say, in the child protection system in 2019. So that's just looking down, you get every age in the system in that 1 year. That's what we're talking about with a system view. But if we're talking about a child view, I want you to look across to the birth years column, okay, on the far left. And the birth year of children, we've got at the top 2006 and at the bottom 2018. And so then we've joined up all their data over time, and so that we can follow them then across calendar years, and that's across the top of the table. And so if you just focus on that very first row in the table, the kids born in 2006, so they're 0 years of age in 2006, and we can follow them through to 2019 when they turn 13 years of age. Okay? Whereas the more recently born children, that, let's say the 2018 birth cohort, that we can follow them when they're 0 and when they turn 1, but then you need more data over time to be integrated to follow them for longer. So each successive birth year cohort has shorter follow-up, but this is how we can build a view to look at when kids and families are first coming into contact and then what their contacts look like over time. So there's a lot on the next slide that I'm going to show you, but what I just want to start with is the main message so that you can then focus on the details with me. So we're going to first look at reports into the child protection system. So remembering this is all coming from outside of the child protection system, and we have a mandatory reporting system, so it's our health professionals, police, early education, community members. So the reports into the system. So what we can see when we look at the data using this life view approach is that many children are reported to Child Protection Services very early in life, with 7 in 10 Aboriginal children reported at least once by their early teens. So bear with me while I just orient you to how to read this figure. So if you look across the bottom, that's the kids ageing over time. So we've got the birth on the far left, and then you can see the big pink arrow saying following children from prenatal, which is that pregnancy period, through to age 13 years of age for the oldest cohort. And all the lines on the figure are every single birth year cohort from 2006 to 2018. And so the green is the 2018, and you can see on the far right side, there's a code for the colours for all the birth years. So these are whole populations of children. And then on the far left, it's the pink arrow going up where it says cumulative incidence. That's just the increasing proportion of children in each of those birth year cohorts who are coming into contact with the child protection system over time. And I just want to point out that up the top it says prenatal reporting period. That grey patch is where prenatal reports are coming in. And you can see we're above 0 in that prenatal reporting period, okay? So in summary, to just pull out a few of the key time points, by the time children are born, across those birth year cohorts, approximately 1 in 10 Aboriginal children have been reported by the time they're born, okay? So that's happening while mum's in the antenatal system. By the time the kids start school at age 5, we're talking about 1 in 2, so half. And by the time you're looking at early teens, we're looking at 7 in 10. And we've got more recent data now, so we can follow this over time. So this continues to increase. So this is quite a different view to what you get when you just look at that snapshot in the system. This is about, over time, entire populations in a birth year period coming into contact. So from all the consultation and our research teams work on this, discussing with stakeholders, these are just several key messages and implications that we've written to summarise this so far. But of course, we're very keen to hear from all of you as well. So the first is that the very high cumulative incidence, or that growing proportion of children, Aboriginal children reported to Child Protection Services from the prenatal period, really, we think, reflects the systemic racism that drives what is often called the causes of child protection contacts, such as poverty, family violence, substance use that requires support, and the past and continuing child welfare policies and practices resulting in the oversurveillance, reporting, and removal of Aboriginal children from their families. What we can see is that the current reporting practices and guidelines propel the majority of Aboriginal children and families into a system that has little or no capacity to provide culturally appropriate, non-stigmatising supportive services. For example, for mums that have substance use or who have inadequate housing, as we hear so often. And these early child protection contacts, as they are at present, they really represent an opportunity to think about how we might redesign the child and family wellbeing system. So we can centre it around early health and social support responses for children and families that ultimately prevent escalating contacts and promote better outcomes for families, including preventing removals. BJ is now going to share a case study that illustrates this.
So Heavenly was only 18 when she had her son, who has high caring needs, and she talked about life with her son in the lead up to his removal. And she said, even though I was a single mum with no family support, I was going well for a long time until I lost my house due to having friends over that would stay over without permission while I was down in Sydney. After I lost my house, that led to us being homeless for a while. Docs got involved for the first time then, and then I moved into a shared accommodation house. That's when my son started eloping. If a gate was left open, a door left open, he would get out and run up the street. I probably spent hundreds and hundreds of dollars trying to fix the gate, but I couldn't rely on that because I knew that to try and rely on 5 people that were living in the house that are not taking care of the child, it's not their responsibility. No matter how much money I spent, how much I watched him, it was one of those things that I knew I couldn't control, and because of him being extra needs and thinking that eloping was a game, it didn't help. He needed to be somewhere safer, and I needed to get back on my feet again because where I was living and how I was living was just not working. I'm not saying that I was a good mum during the time, but I just know that I'm a young mum that doesn't have family support and that has a special needs child that just needed more support. They had the opportunity to do that and they didn't. So Heavenly was later supported to move into a housing refuge for young mums on a big property where her son could have run around safely. She lived there for 2 years while trying to get him restored. She believed that that had she been moved there to begin with, he would not have been removed because her biggest source of stress was that her son was not in a safe living situation.
Okay, so now we're moving into the next stage of the system. So we're looking at those first screening processes that Child Protection undertake to then determine whether a report meets their at risk of significant harm threshold. So the figure is similar to the last one, it's just that this time we're looking at those screened in reports at Roche. So what we can see again is that 1 to 2 in every 10 children by birth have been screened in at Roche. So pretty much the same number that are being reported into the system. And by the time kids are starting school, we've got 4 to 5 in 10. So almost half again across the birth year cohorts have been screened in at Roche, and 6 in 10 by the time they're in their early teens. So most Aboriginal children reported to Child Protection Services from the prenatal period are being screened in at risk of significant harm by the Child Protection system. So this really means that at this point of the process, the Child Protection screening practices are propelling most Aboriginal children and families further into the system, despite it having little or no capacity to provide culturally appropriate, non-stigmatising supportive services. Again, these high and early screened-in reports represent an opportunity to mobilise health and social supports to prevent escalation through the child protection system. And I think it's very important that we're talking about who's best placed to be delivering those supports and what that means for the intake system, the screening system, and the whole of government response to this, as well as the involvement of the community-controlled sector. And I guess that's the last point, is that it highlights the need for system redesign centred around child and family wellbeing, including reviewing the screening and other intake practices. BJ?
So Sabrina talked about how rather than supporting families with what they might need and being transparent about reporting processes, DCJ collect evidence about families in the background to support their case for when they're ready to remove children. Sabrina said, "Roche reports happen before you even know there's a problem. A case has started to be built. You aren't aware of what's going on. He was looking after her. He had her on the couch when she was like a month old and she spewed on him. He put her down, went to change his shirt, and she fell off the couch. I was trying to have a nap. I heard a thud. I heard her crying. I came down, saw what happened. He told me what happened. Even though I wasn't looking after her at the time, I called up the helpline for advice, and that was a Roche report. There was another incident after we broke up, and she was with her dad standing on a bucket upside down. It was a slippery floor. She slipped off the bucket. I saw it happen. She slipped off the bucket and hit her head on the bottom of the metal shelves with her dad in his care. She had bruising all week at school. I didn't cover up the bruises. The school didn't say anything, but then her dad hadn't seen her all week, and he went to pick her up on the Monday, and he made a big fuss about the bruises. Another Roche report goes on my name, even though the bruises happened in his care. That was another one. So these are lovely cases being built up against me in the background. She used to wet the bed. When she started going to kindergarten, she started to be overtired, so she wouldn't get up in the middle of the night and go to the bathroom. There was a service, and I asked them how to help her through that. I also mentioned at the time that my new partner had gambling issues, and I was wondering how to handle that and deal with it. So here I am thinking engaging is a good thing, seeking help is a good thing, but in fact it's not. I later know by looking at those files that they flagged me. So here they are flagging me and making sure there's extra people to look after my case.
Okay, so now we're up to child protection investigations across the life course. So by the time children are born, 1 in 20 Aboriginal children and their families have had an investigation by Child Protection Services. By the time children are starting school at age 5, we've got 1 in 5 Aboriginal children have been investigated, and by the early teens, we've got 1 in 3, so a third. And I guess overall, if we're just looking at the, sorry, I'll just go back. If you look at the successive birth year cohorts, pink is the older cohorts born in 2006 and green is the more recently born children. And very clearly in this figure, we can see that in more recent birth year cohorts, the investigations are higher. So it's happening earlier and more often in more recently born cohorts.
So Shelley was a child in care herself and had been removed from her mother by the same DCJ office that would later remove her children. Shelley was raising her children on her own after leaving her violent ex-partner. DCJ began investigating reports made against Shelley from anonymous reporters, and Shelley recalls how she was treated by the DCJ workers investigating the allegations. She said, "So my understanding now is that they're only really supposed to have 2, maximum 3 workers come. 1 to write notes and 1 to whatever. I had 5. There was 5 of them, and they wouldn't sit at my table. Fax workers, the response team. Yeah, it was really bad. It was only me by myself, and they wouldn't stand as well. They would stand as well. They wouldn't sit at my table. So I'm sitting and they're talking over me, and they would say that I was abusive and that I was the one that was yelling. Why would I yell at someone who was potentially going to take my children away? So they would come over in big loads, and sometimes every day. Some reports that were put against me, one of them said that I had drugs in my cupboard at hip height or whatever it was, and I was like, I haven't been home, go to my room. I let them go and have a look. Couldn't find nothing, obviously, because there was nothing there, it was false. So I was giving them clean urines, and then they came to me. I remember there was 5 of them, and I was like, look, you were saying I used drugs. I've proved you wrong. Their reasoning for high risk was previous drug use and previous domestic violence. So the domestic violence, I've addressed it. I've done a course for it. I've charged him. He's gone to jail. I've charged him again. What more do you want me to do? The drug use, I've given you clean urine. And she goes, yeah, well, we feel like we're going to have to start taking your hair as well. So from that point, the way she said it, it was like, you know what, there's nothing I can do. I'll fight, but I wasn't going to win.
Okay, so now we're at child protection defined substantiations, and we've used that term very intentionally because substantiations are essentially defined using the tools and practices of the child protection system. So by the time children are born, 1 in 50 Aboriginal children have had a substantiation. By the time they start school, 1 in 5 have had a substantiation, and by the early teens, 3 in 10. And we can see in the data again that child protection defined substantiations are occurring more often and earlier in life in the more recently born birth year cohorts.
And so just on the point about using the term DCJ, defined substantiations, we also do that deliberately because we know that DCJ may conclude that a child is at risk or has been mistreated, but that conclusion is drawn from biases and cherry picking and presenting evidence in a way that suits the conclusion or the outcome that supports their agenda. So Trent's experience, he said, it basically started off with someone knocking on our door and they said there was apparently complaints of domestic violence. We had no history of domestic violence. There was no police involvement with domestic violence. Then 2 days later, they told us that we can't get our kids from school. From the start, there was no asking or evidence of what they were actually saying. It was just accusation after accusation. They grilled us, saying everything. It's violence, mental health, drugs, everything they could. Even if we had no record of it, it didn't matter. We just basically got targeted and they said, this is you, this is you, this is you. The big kicker was we ended up getting a letter at the end of all this saying that they had no reason to intervene in our family to start off with. That was 3 years later. We went through hell. Someone needs to be held accountable for the injustice.
Okay, and so now we're at removal into out-of-home care. So by age 1, we've taken it to age 1 because obviously removals can start from birth, but we've taken it to age 1 for this statistic. So by the time children are 1 year old, 1 in 25 Aboriginal children have had their first out-of-home care placement. By the time they're starting school at 5 years of age, almost 1 in 10 have had at least one out-of-home care placement. And by the time they're in their early teens, 1 in 7. So the cumulative incidence of first out-of-home care placements has remained fairly similar among birth year cohorts from 2006 to 2018, despite multiple reviews recommending reforms to support the preservation and restoration of Aboriginal children and families over time.
When children are removed, it's near impossible for them to come home again, particularly after final orders. And Kimberly will talk more about why restoration is so rare. But spoiler alert, the system has been created this way. This destroys children, parents, and their entire families that impacts them throughout their entire lives. And I want to share a bit of Chloe's story. Chloe said, "It was my first relationship and I didn't really know much about domestic violence, so I didn't really have any tools around how to cope with that situation. I was out of home with a violent person and it felt really lonely. I stayed with him for a long time. I was scared of being a single mum with these 2 children. I had no idea what I was doing, but I just knew I wanted better for them. I went home, I tried to get my own place, tried to be independent. On top of that, I had my ex-partner who was still coming in and out. I didn't want to be with him, and the kids were always used as a tool in porn. He used to take my son and refused to give him back to me. I was overwhelmed. It got to the point where my mental health was worn down and broken, and I started using drugs as a way to cope, and I had a full-on mental breakdown and my kids were removed. They were put with my ex and his mum. So I just went hard on the drugs. I was hurt, I was broken, and I just had to shut down and block it all out. And then something inside me just clicked and I got clean. I started getting up on my own 2 feet and supporting myself and just trying to be in the kids' lives as much as I could be. I used to get told by the old docs worker that I had no parental responsibility over my children. I'm only their biological mother. There's no sensitivity at all. I would be sitting there crying my eyes out. I always felt like I was the big sister. I never once was made to feel like I was the mother and that I had any say in my children's life at all. I was never told what I needed to do or how I could go about getting restoration of my kids. I basically had to do it all myself. The thing that gets me is that if I had the interventional support around me to help support me with my issues rather than just taking my kids off me, then a lot of things would have worked out the way they did. I just remember feeling so alone and I had to do everything myself. I've been clean for over 12 years now. I tried so hard for so long to get the kids back and I kept getting knocked back. Every time I went for a Section 90, I think I got knocked back 3 or 4 times before about 2 years ago my son ran away from his grandmother and his father. He told me he'd been really badly abused and mistreated. I'm angry that my kids were removed from my care because I was an unfit mother 12 years ago. They put me into a placement that was unsafe for them to be in the first place. Now, all these years later, I've got my kids back, and now my kids have got so much trauma that happened to them. I'm sitting here left to deal with all this trauma, and I just feel as though someone needs to be held accountable or responsible for that.
So we've produced this infographic together with many groups in the sector. We've spoken to, obviously the FIC advisory group have had a lot of input, DCJ, ARG, our partners in the research. There's been many, but we'd love to hear any thoughts or feedback from you. This is now available. So it summarises the information that we just presented in terms of the data and the evidence. And I'll hand over to you. Oh, and I guess you just wanted me to add that this is just the first sort of piece of work in terms of the first contacts into the system. We've also been looking at the first 2 years in out-of-home care, because through the qualitative research with parents and in community and with practitioners, the first 2 years really highlighted as a very important time for getting kids home. And so we'll be looking forward to sharing that with you in the near future.
Okay, so we're just going to talk about the context of the child protection system. As you know, Australia was invaded and used as a penal colony, which follows the carceral logic. So that carceral logic continues into the way that the child protection is used by the settler colonial agenda and white saviours and white supremacist thinking to remove Aboriginal children from their families, community, culture and country. It's built upon pathologising, categorising, decontextualising of people's responses to challenging circumstances, locating the problem in the individual, racialised communities, leaving no room to acknowledge skills, knowledge or context. What it does is it replaces one set of risks with another set of actual harms to children and families, communities and cultures. Criminal justice is criminal justice processes are mechanisms of pain delivery. That is, they are sites of harm and forms of harmful practices in themselves. We have a system that structurally abandons children, families and carers. They often ask for help, and what they get is an institutionalised violence response. The way this looks I've just tried to put it in a diagram. As you can see from the data, we have a surveillance system that is that is upheld by the mandatory reporting processes. And in that white supremacist thinking that we were talking about before, white supremacists privilege the written word over oral history. And so we have a heavy reliance on evidence gathering, which starts at the point of the investigation, the ongoing assessments, case planning, ongoing collecting of evidence from other practitioners through subpoenas, and they don't require a high burden of proof in order to justify their decisions. Their affidavits construct a particular narrative, and even though they're model litigants, the report writing and the expert witnesses often omit what is the truth for families. These court processes often support, in 90% of the cases, the decision or the recommendation from DCJ, docs, facts, whatever you want to call it, and it's all done behind closed doors in a closed court system. We then have children's court assessments, which a lot of you have spoken about, and the harmful practices that psychological torture that they put families through. And they take children into organised care, where they are ongoingly surveilled and they are more likely to be reported to police and then incarcerated. So when we're talking about documentation, the courts are looking for what's written, what's documented in the files, what's documented in the affidavits. But it's interesting to ask the question, what are we paying attention to? Aboriginal astronomy speaks to Aboriginal people's worldviews and walking in two worlds. What I've recently learned is that Aboriginal cultures looked between the stars for true meaning and not at the stars. So what we're inviting you to consider is what's really going on for families. What did DCJ omit from their affidavits? What was the broader context that the family was responding to? What systems harm is not factored into the narrative and into the pathologising practices? You probably know most psychometric assessment tools or most psychological assessment tools don't factor in systemic violence. Talking about systemic violence, state-sanctioned violence is a series of interrelated and interdependent actions that are organised and administered through legitimate means. They are not exceptional. They are ordinary and they are routinely carried out in the name of helping or in the name of child protection. As you know, most of the families, and a lot of you guys too, also try to resist the institutional harm, but the institutions anticipate this resistance and they further punish or criminalise those acts of resistance. Many families identify the power imbalances really early on, and as victims of the system and due to being in a state of exhaustion, and they understand that their resistance is futile and they are forced to abandon the fight. This is the colonial code that's written by two white guys, Todd and Wade, from Canada. They did a paper that tried to explain the correlation between psychology and invasion. And so they've come up with this, I find, interesting code called the colonial code. So it starts off with, you are deficient. Either you're a savage, you're uncivilised, you're unintelligent, vulnerable, a child, a victim, uneducated, or you just simply don't understand. I'm competent, I'm white, I'm superior, I'm civilised, I'm educated, I'm professional, I'm experienced. Therefore, I have the right, the duty, and the privilege, and the responsibility to perform operations on you with or without your consent. But these operations are carried out for your own good. Kathy Richardson, a Métis professor from Canada, has added, while we steal your land, and I've added, and your children.
Oh, we're not done, but that's amazing. And the colonial code is always so powerful and just... Did you want to do that one? Oh. Hang on. The slides have mucked up. We'll go back to key takeaway messages. Okay, do that one first.
Yeah. So I'm just going to quote here Marsha Langton, who said, "A critical task of professionals, academics and educators is to decolonise ourselves by recognising how we have all been affected by colonisation. Part of the colonising project of the colonisers has been to define who and what the colonised were or are, and in response, part of the Indigenous struggle has been to recover the right to self-definition. An anti-colonial stance requires both an understanding of how colonial hegemony has distorted realities and identities for both colonisers and colonised, along with a willingness and a commitment to reveal and disrupt the process." And back to that, we're looking at what's in between the stars, what was not said in the files, what's not said in our documentation, what is the truth-telling that is not documented and not reflected in our case notes and in our reports.
So what we have learned through our Bring Them Home, Keep Them Home research confirms what so many Aboriginal advocates have been saying for decades, that the real risk to families is the risks of their children being forcibly removed by the state rather than supporting their children to remain with them, and particularly their mothers. The system traumatises children and families every day by the fact that their children are in out-of-home care. This causes much more harm in both the short and long term than leaving them with their families in an environment that is perceived as a risk to their safety. The latest Australian Institute of Health and Welfare data reports that across Australia, so-called child neglect and emotional abuse accounted for 80% of all maltreatment substantiations. This is a serious problem because child neglect is not intentional. If it is, it's a form of deprivational abuse. Neglect really refers to the neglect of the broader family and generally extends to the socio-economic environment where the family lives. The entire family needs to be supported to meet their needs and address the impact and drivers of poverty and social disadvantage. Emotional abuse usually refers to a child's exposure to domestic violence. Rather than recognising the importance of the child's relationship with their mother, their reciprocal love and protection for one another, children are ripped away from their mother when they need her the most. Emotional abuse might also extend to casting a deficit lens on a parent who is experiencing distress or with drug and alcohol use. This should not be pathologised or criminalised or used as justification for taking that child away from their parents. Rather, it is all part of the family context and should inform social and therapeutic responses to support the family as a family. From our research, we have found that parents who need some support with their mental health or drug and alcohol use were motivated to function well because they needed to look after their children. It was when their children were removed that they were tipped over the edge and, like in Chloe's case, used drugs and alcohol as a way to numb the pain and grief of losing her children. So to quote Sabrina, one of our other mums, she said, "When your kids are removed, it feels like your kids have died. That's the grief you feel." 80% of children across Australia have substantiations related to child neglect or emotional abuse. The overwhelming response and social and political solution is to remove those children, to legally abduct those children. This is cruel and inhumane. This should not be acceptable. Removal must be the exception and not the rule. The focus must be on keeping families together and when children have been removed, getting them back to their families as soon as possible. This isn't about permanency, it's about preventing further trauma and damage to children and families. This is about supporting rather than punishing poverty. There are two ways to reduce the number of Aboriginal children in out-of-home care. Stop removing Aboriginal children and restore Aboriginal children from out-of-home care to their families. Everyone has a role in this, and this is everyone's responsibility. Kathleen's statistics demonstrate that 1 in 5 Aboriginal children will be subject to a child protection investigation and substantiation by the time they start school. This suggests that a big source of this oversurveillance and reporting is coming from the time women are pregnant, from the health, policing and early education sectors. Professionals who believe they are doing the right thing by following mandatory reporting laws without understanding that they are simply following the colonial code and funneling families into a carceral system. These are big conversations and solutions require a complete dismantling of the way all government systems currently operate and understand their roles in supporting families. There must be a seismic shift in the way societies think about terms like risk, protection, and safety. These are all loaded terms which have been used to demonise families, facilitate white saviorism and benevolence, and perpetuate the racist and historical legacies of government systems that have been founded for the purposes of destroying Aboriginal families, cultures, and sovereignty. So what is something that all of us can do, no matter our role and interaction with the child protection system? Challenge the negative assumptions made about families, particularly mothers. Question the dominant narrative that is being constructed against the family and always look for the family's voice in the situation. What are they saying? What are they responding to? What do they think of the narrative that's being constructed against them? If you don't know, find out. Families' voices must be amplified above all else if we are to disrupt and overcome the violence of colonial systems that continue to cause more harm than good. And we're 1 minute and 20 seconds over. I don't know if we have time for Q&A. Thanks, everyone.